What was the Good Neighbor policy, and how did it impact Cuba? What were some of the key events and figures involved in Cuban politics during the 1930s and 1940s? How did Fidel Castro come to power, and what were some of the factors that contributed to his success? The Good Neighbor policy was a foreign policy doctrine adopted by the United States towards Latin American countries in the 1930s. It was based on the principle of non-intervention and aimed to improve relations between the United States and Latin American countries. The policy called for the removal of U.S. military troops from Latin America and the promotion of economic cooperation and cultural exchange. In June 1934, under the auspices of the policy, a treaty was concluded that abrogated the Platt Amendment, a document that had given the United States the right to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs. During the 1930s and 1940s, Cuba experienced political turmoil and instability. Fulgencio Batista, a former army sergeant who gained control of the army after the downfall of President Gerardo Machado, was a key figure in Cuban politics during this time. He held power through two presidents and eventually became president himself in 1940, serving until 1944. Batista established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and supported the Allied effort in World War II. In 1948, Carlos Prío Socarrás became president, but his domestic agenda stalled in the face of economic troubles and government corruption. Batista overthrew Prío's government in March 1952 without bloodshed, closed Congress, and called for elections in 1954. He was elected president without opposition and reinstated the 1940 Constitution, which contained many liberal pro-labor reforms, but strong opposition developed against him. Among the primary concerns of large landowners was the Sugar Act of 1956, U.S. legislation that sharply curtailed Cuban sugar imports to the benefit of domestic producers. With Cuban sugar exports facing an uncertain future, support for Batista within both the government and the influential agriculture industry virtually collapsed. Fidel Castro, a revolutionary leader, came to power after a guerrilla campaign against Batista in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Castro was educated in Santiago de Cuba and Havana, and while he was still a student, he participated in revolutionary activities throughout Latin America. In 1952, he was a candidate for the Cuban People's Party, but Batista's coup preempted the election, and Castro soon settled on an alternative means for challenging the dictatorship. On July 26, 1953, he led around 160 men in a desperate and unsuccessful raid on a Santiago army barracks. He had hoped that the attack would ignite a general uprising against Batista, but most of the attackers were killed, and Castro and his brother Raúl were arrested and imprisoned. In 1955, the Castro brothers received amnesty and were released, whereupon Fidel went to Mexico, where he began organizing an invading force of Cuban exiles. In December 1956, accompanied by a band of 81 men on board the yacht Granma, Castro landed in eastern Cuba, but most of the force was quickly killed or captured. Among the dozen men who escaped were the Castro brothers and Ernesto Che Guevara. This small band then began a guerrilla campaign against Batista, and their eventual success led to the establishment of a communist government in Cuba.